Thank you so much. I just want to thank you all for inviting me. I want to thank Yusuf and Dr. Badi in particular for all the labor that went into organizing this event. Yusuf asked me to talk about Gulf Arab investments in Sudanese land, and I'm going to do that. But I want to say I actually haven't talked very much in public, in part because I've written about what's going on, but part of it is because I feel like there's a real need right now to amplify the voices that are coming out of the ground, to Skype them in whenever possible. Of course, with the internet blackout, that's a little bit more difficult, but I just want you to know, because I'm a bit nervous about speaking about this. So I was asked to talk about Gulf Arab investments in Sudanese land, but I want to do something, which is I want you to all take a moment. For those of you who've been following from the beginning, for those of you who might have participated in this revolution, I want you to think about a moment when you were very inspired by what has been happening in Sudan. I want you to kind of hold on to that, okay? Because I think before jumping into analysis and history, it can be easy for me to forget that, given the devastating violence of the past week, of this regime, right? And so when we honor our martyrs, I want to honor not only the martyrs of the June 3rd massacre and what happened in Village and Central Darfur, but also of the last 30 years, right? And of this revolution. Okay, so for me, this was one of these moments when one of the first protests emerged out of Atbara, led by secondary school students, converging with others in a city known for its railroad worker union organizing and history of resistance to both colonial and post-colonial regimes. A place where the NCP regime cracked down on this organizing, dismantling the unions, and laying off 4,000 railroad workers in one day in 1991. And then in April, when the global media's attention was narrowly focused on the sit-in in Khartoum, despite the fact that people were continuing to protest across Sudan in places like Niala and Zalinje in Darfur, for instance, where protesters continued to be targeted and shot at by security forces without any interference from the military in April, right? And so then in April, we saw delegations from Niala and Atbara and other cities come to Khartoum. And here Atbara is arriving by train to this warm welcome on April 23rd. Another moment was hearing from a close friend from Niala who traveled to the sit-in in Khartoum by land in late April, who got involved in organizing nightly lectures and a makeshift gallery of images documenting some of the atrocities this regime had committed over the last 30 years in places like the Nuba Mountains, South Sudan, and in her hometown. And just hearing her talk about what having the opportunity to lead this political education meant to her was really powerful and inspiring. Right? It became this kind of microcosm of the new Sudan that people were trying to create. And I start with this because while I study Gulf investments in Sudanese land and state-driven land dispossession in the eastern Blue Nile region, so I'm not actually in the Jazeera scheme, but on the other side where land is not titled, right? That's an important distinction. While I study that, I focus on the ways people are negotiating and organizing against the latest wave of land enclosures through Gulf investments and how these changes in land ownership are reconfiguring the relationship between landless and landholding communities. And by that I mean landless farm workers, pastoralists, seasonal harvesters, dispossessed smallholder farmers, local landowners, and also local investors, right? And the forms of resistance I study are shaped by people's specific relationships to land and to the state. They have, over the years since I began this research in 2011, ranged from civil disobedience and sabotage tactics, burning down the water pumps of foreign-owned agribusiness farms, destroying irrigation canals when they were first being constructed, to legal advocacy, right? Making claims to land the government has deemed unproductive and untitled, despite the fact that pastoralists and farmers have been using it for generations. And these claims were made both in and outside the formal court system, often driven by the work of independent farmers' unions that have become now part of the opposition. Two, social-spatial forms of resistance, mostly by landless workers, like seed banking, destroying fence enclosures to regain access to traditional grazing routes, growing subsistence food at the edges of commercial farms, to worker organizing through something called sanadiq, which are like these savings circles through which people pool their resources. A couple of points I want to make before giving you some of the latest data on large-scale land deals in Sudan. The history of land enclosures and land dispossession in Sudan is incredibly violent and layered, and access to Sudanese land has always been racialized, class, and gendered. As much as people speak of a recent land rush in Sudan and in Africa more broadly, it is not new, nor can we separate it from this violent colonial and post-colonial history of dispossession. I remember participating in a project in Niada in 2009 with the same friend I mentioned earlier to document, among many other things, the linkages between the genocide and the state and state-driven resource and land grab that went hand in hand with it, which violently dispossessed people from areas that were mineral rich. You now have gold mining concessions granted to South African, British, and Russian companies in some of these areas, with 13 of them in the production stage. Hemeti, as you probably know, owns several gold mines in the Jabal Amir area of North Darfur. Similar reports have emerged from South Kordofan as well, and there's a continuity here between state violence facilitating resource grabs in marginalized areas of the country that the Jazeera, being in central Sudan, has mostly been shielded from. Another point is that the legal framework that paved the way for this current wave of land dispossessions was created under British colonial rule with the aim of bringing communal lands under state control for the extraction of cotton and other cash crops to fuel the British Industrial Revolution. After independence, elements of these colonial land laws were adopted almost verbatim into the Unregistered Land Act passed under Nimeri in 1970. And Guma Kunda Komi does really great work on this, with subsequent revisions of this law in 1984, and then under this regime to attract foreign investors. As the laws currently stand, domestic and foreign investors who establish agribusiness farms on Sudanese land bear virtually no responsibility in relation to the communities who are dispossessed in the process, in terms of compensation, jobs, infrastructure, and development. From the investor point of view, Sudan under the Bashir regime was one of the easiest places to obtain cheap land with no strings attached, which is why you saw Emirati and Saudi investments in Sudan reach $16 and $13 billion respectively in the post-secession period, with most of this money going into real estate and land. In the 1970s, this legal framework was used by the Nimeri regime to violently dispossess and displace communities in Sudan's peripheral regions, like South Sudan, Kordofan, Blue Nile area, in order to violently suppress dissent and to facilitate the exploitation of their natural resources. As Nimeri was trying to resolve the country's deepening debt crisis back then in the 1970s, this gave rise to a vision of transforming Sudan into the breadbasket of the Middle East, right? Through the expansion of mechanized farming financed by Gulf investors. At the time, these Gulf countries were dealing with their own twin oil crises of the 1970s, which gave them the incentive to invest. And while most of these Gulf finance projects ultimately failed for a variety of reasons, they succeeded in creating the infrastructure, legal framework, institutions, and relationships that paved the way for this current wave of Gulf investments in the post-secession period under the al-Bashir regime. And I bring up, you might wonder, why am I bringing up Nimeri? Well, I bring up Nimeri and the pro-NCP era because land justice in Sudan hinges on the dismantling of this legal framework and on a post-colonial order which allow both Nimeri and al-Bashir to stay in power for so long, and to violently suppress dissent and to dispossess people of their land and resources in marginalized areas. So it's difficult to verify access data on large-scale land deals in Sudan. But about 32 such deals have been signed over the last 2 decades, for periods ranging from 20 to 99-year leases. 18 of those 32 deals are now in operation. To date, these deals have brought an estimated 5 million acres of Sudanese land under the control of domestic and foreign agribusiness investors. Of the investors, which include Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, Lebanon, Turkey, and Syria, Saudi and Emirati companies have signed the largest number of leases. Having secured over 15 deals for over 1 million acres of land, these Saudi and Emirati companies now own more Sudanese land than all of Sudan's domestic investors combined. Okay, so I just want you to think about that. The majority of these agribusiness farms, right, and this is one of them, this is an Emirati farm owned by an Al-Har group called the Zaid al-Khair farm. This is kind of what they look like. Here, the Zaid al-Khair farm they grow alfalfa. The majority of these agribusiness farms produce wheat, cotton, peanuts, biofuels, and a variety of crops for animal consumption on dairy farms such as alfalfa. This is from the Dominican Republic, the seed. Much of this land has been cordoned off with big fences and security guards that will shoot at people when they try to enter, that cut off access to it for pastoralists and farmers, but in many cases only a small portion of the farm is actually in operation. So I want you to look at this. This is the Al-Anhad farm where neighboring communities where I do my research, and the green area is the only area that is currently in operation. Okay? And so many of these farms are acting as placeholders, but also as a way of funneling money into the pockets of the NCP regime in order to further Saudi, in my opinion, Saudi and Emirati geopolitical interests. Like getting Sudan to send thousands of troops to fight in the war on Yemen on their behalf. In return, the UAE and Saudi Arabia has lobbied on Sudan's behalf to get the US government to partially lift Clinton-era sanctions and to get Sudan off the Muslim ban list. Similarly, for Egypt, this is about water and about losing arable land once Ethiopia's Renaissance Dam is built. As these investment dollars were flowing into the accounts of the al-Bashir regime, they were simultaneously trying to re-qualify for International Monetary Fund loans. So we saw in late 2017, the IMF issuing a series of recommendations to Sudan, including the removal of fuel and wheat subsidies. And these austerity measures were implemented somewhat unevenly by the regime to hit rural areas harder, where they assumed people weren't as capable of organizing resistance against them as, say, in Khartoum. And this revolution has obviously proven otherwise. I did my research over 15 months in several communities impacted by large-scale land deals. And so you can see the two farms, some of the farms here, which included deals signed with the domestic company Dal, which I'm sorry to tell you, owns the popular coffee shop Ozone. A Saudi billionaire who eventually lost his deal due to organized resistance in Udom. I followed that case for several years. And with the Emirati Al-Anhar group in the Wadrawa region, which I'm also going to focus on here. I spent most of my time in these communities and on farms during the planting season and planting and harvesting season, but also in courts, at investor conferences, in the zawiyas of Sufi sheikhs like Azra Qlayba, who was mediating some of the disputes that have come out of this, but also contributing to kind of union organizing around this. And also with the Sudanese managers of foreign and domestic agribusiness farms. So I'm going to end with a few moments from my fieldwork. The expansion of agribusiness farms made many small farmers go into debt because they can't compete with industrial agriculture, right? And so many have had to sell their land to wealthier landowners. So parallel with this kind of expansion of these foreign-owned agribusiness farms, we've also seen a consolidation of smaller farms into medium-sized Sudanese-owned commercial farms that hire landless farm workers, mostly women, and young male overseers to manage these farms during the planting season. And they also hire seasonal harvesters from other parts of Sudan, Gadarif, the west of Sudan, some even from South Sudan, during the harvest season. And these farms are increasingly using petrochemical fertilizers and insecticides that are contaminating not only soil and water, but are also affecting the health of workers. And by the way, what you eat, right? The tomatoes, everything that's in the market. So this is from a work shift during the harvesting season on a commercial farm that borders Zaid al-Khair farm. This is just an excerpt from my notes, my diary. Nafisa, who is a recent college graduate in agricultural science, points to a fine white residue on the okras we have been harvesting that sits like a thin layer of powdered sugar on everything around us. Our clothes, faces, hair, hands, the soil. She then pulls my scarf a bit tighter around my mouth and nose and takes a black polyester glove out of her bag, insisting that I wear it for the rest of our work shift. A few minutes later, we hear a woman cough a few rows behind us, and Nafisa walks over to hand her a scarf. Hadiya, wrap this around your face. This stuff will give you asthma, she says. Before we head home that afternoon, Nafisa, who as I mentioned, she's a recent college graduate in agricultural science. She's originally from the Nuba Mountains and has been working harvesting to make ends meet. So Nafisa and I are walking home and we discover a pack of seeds and a tin of insecticides in the thicket between lines of okra. They read in English, Indian hybrid seeds treated with thyrum poison, that's the first picture, and Scythion malathion. A frantic internet search on Nafisa's tiny phone screen reads, malathion is highly contaminating. Some studies have found increased incidence of some cancers in people who are regularly exposed to pesticides, such as farmers and pesticide applicators. Thyrum has demonstrated reproductive and/or developmental toxicity in experimental animals. In women, exposure to pesticides like thyrum from environmental sources or at work has been associated with adverse effects on fertility, pregnancy, and the health of offspring. I translate with caution. Nafisa has studied agriculture. She knows the implications of being exposed to these toxins for long periods of time better than any of us, which is why she carries extra scarves and gloves with her when she harvests to distribute to others. Over the course of my fieldwork, I learned anecdotally of cases of cancer and asthma since the farms they work on began importing pesticides from China and India without any regulations. Rumors abound on WhatsApp about the deliberate contamination of underground soil and water sources by investors seeking to maximize their agricultural output and profits for the duration of their 20 or 50-year leases. But the lack of tangible evidence to support these claims keeps these discussions from reaching a court of law. Instead, Nafisa and others organize around the immediacy of Sudan's deepening economic and political crisis. One by one, they slip away during our work shift to stuff small bags with grass for their goats and vegetables for their families, as others keep an eye on their young male overseers who are mostly engrossed in conversation or glued to their cell phones. At the end of our work shifts, I watch them pool a portion of their wages and hand it over to Nafisa, who ties it into the corner of her hijab. They explain to me that they rotate their savings, trade seeds, and plant food at the edges of these farms they work on to make ends meet. Another excerpt. Here's a quote from a woman who used to work on the Zaid al-Khair farm. They treat you like a number on Al-Mansouri's farm. That's the Emirati guy who owns the farm. We form lines at the beginning of each shift, and then the overseer calls out your number, compares it against your ID. If you miss a few shifts because of an emergency, they replace you. You can't go back. If you slow down during your work shift or just straighten your back, one of the Syrian or Egyptian overseers will tell you to pick up the pace or get back to it. Even going to the bathroom can be a problem. At the end of our shift in the afternoon, they load us onto the back of a truck and drop us off near Al-Mahas. You know those trucks they use to carry cattle? Those ones, she laughs. This is what it's like. Okay, and one more quote. The following is a quote from a Hassaniya pastoralist in his late 60s who was explaining the impact of land enclosures to me by spatially mapping it on the ground. Before the Khalijis came and built these large fences around their farm, he said, I used to move daily with my herd from the riverbank up through the edges of these farming plots into the khala and back, sometimes several times a day. These roads, the fences, the security guards, the water pumps, they all didn't exist before, he tells me, drawing figures into the air as if to keep them clear of his map. From here, he says, pointing to the eastern edges of one of the plots he has drawn, I could move undisturbed with my animals until what is today Ethiopia, if I had wanted to. The khala had no limits. But now, where is the khala? It is running away from us. So I think it's important, finally, to link these discussions of environmental degradation that I just mentioned, accelerated by industrial farming, to the exploitation of people's labor, right? Currently, a seasonal harvester is paid 50 Sudanese pounds, which is like, I think $1.50 at the time, this was in 2018, right? For a 5 a.m. to Maghrib shift on the Zaid al-Khair farm, okay? On the commercial farm that Nafisa works on, they get paid 25 pounds for a 7 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. shift, but they receive a shawwal of half a shawwal of bamia, of okra, which they use to supplement their income. given the hikes in food prices over the last few years, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, right? This amounts to very little. And so there are some groups of women harvesters, and this was incredibly inspiring to me, who have started using their sanadiq, these saving circles, as a kind of organizing body to put pressure on farm owners to raise their wages, threatening to go on strike if they don't. Okay? So I'm out of time, but I just say that witnessing this kind of organizing and the growth also of independent farmers unions across the Jazeera that were fighting state policies aimed at dispossessing them of their land. There were some policies that started sort of 2005. You know, the Jazeera used to be a stronghold of this regime, right, of the NCP. But witnessing this kind of organizing, I think, was an indication of what was to come. Okay, thank you very much.